Hi there everyone, welcome to today's video on Plato's Meno dialogue. The Meno dialogue is really fun and philosophically very rich. We're going to be talking a lot in today's video about the relationship between Plato's thought and mathematics, because we're going to see that this plays on an increasingly central role throughout the Platonic text that we're going to discuss. And the Meno is one of the most explicit places where Plato really reflects on this relationship between his own philosophy and mathematical truths. And so it's really, really fascinating, interesting material to go through with you all. Now, sort of the central aspect of the Meno is Meno asks Socrates this question: can virtue be taught? Right? It can be difficult to understand the resonance of this question when you hear it at first. It kind of seems like a quintessentially Greek question in some ways, and I think that it is. But, another way of reframing Meno's question is Meno is asking about philosophy and sophism, right? Sophists go around, they claim that they're teaching kind of civic virtue, right? But one of the ways that Plato and Socrates respond to these figures pretty regularly is to say, how can you teach someone to be virtuous if you don't even have virtue, or if you don't even know what virtue is? And so, from Socrates and Plato, sort of this accusation that, like, well, you're already planning to sell virtue to people, but you don't even know what it is, and you don't know its characteristics. Like, can it really even be passed down in this way at all? And so the implication is that because the sophists haven't resolved these sort of questions, we should view their practice as kind of bunk. And that's, one of Plato / Socrates' sort of points against the sophists that are really essential to Platonic philosophy. And so in asking if virtue can be taught, you're also asking, like, what is the nature of education? Like, should education look like, a sophist teaching your child or, young adults, children, how to participate in civic life and so on? And then finally, the question that's sort of like more generally raised by this dialogue is, what is knowledge? Like, what is knowledge of virtue versus knowledge of these other things? Why does it seem like, knowledge of crafts can be, like, passed down, right? Like, if I'm really good at crochet, right? Maybe I learned because I was an apprentice, and maybe someone will apprentice under me, and so on, right? But why does it seem like in the cases of virtue, right, and moral goodness, that morally good people don't always result from this kind of education, right? One thing that Socrates always points out is that sometimes, like, really, really just and noble people have really, really unjust and ignoble, children, right? Uh, so the question is sort of like, well, how does that happen? A lot of the ancient Greeks kind of thought, like, oh, well, if you're, born into the right kind of family, then it's almost by clockwork that you are going to end up virtuous and noble yourself. But, obviously that wasn't fully the case. Otherwise, they wouldn't have to ask these kinds of practical questions, right? So there's a lot of dialogue between Socrates and Meno that is really sort of like dialogue that's mostly about, how Meno puts his trust into these sophist type figures, and Socrates is to some extent imploring him, right? Socrates is constantly like, well, before we talk about can virtue be taught, can you please at least give me a definition of virtue, right? And there's lots of parts of the dialogue that I think will be basically familiar to you, having already tackled the Euthyphro, for example, where Meno makes a lot of like typical mistakes of opponents of Socrates, right? Socrates will ask Meno like what virtue is, and Meno will not give one answer, but will give several answers, right? Meno will say things like, well, virtue for a man is being courageous in battle, and virtue for a woman is being domesticated, and so on and so forth, right? But Socrates always insists, well, okay, sure, fine, let's accept that for now. But what is the general form of virtue that is informing all of these instances, right? This is the same essential kind of response that he gave to the Euthyphro. Show me the form of virtue, right? Don't just give me all of these examples, but give me, its general form, give me a general account, right? And then the dialogue really takes a turn. The virtue stuff is a little less important than what comes next, where Meno basically says something along the lines of, hey, we should just give up on all this trying to understand virtue business because it's like impossible to learn things anyway, right? Just interesting move. This sort of thing where you kind of like hand wave away, like uh, the existence of knowledge and stuff like that. That's sort of like a classic ancient Greek move in some ways, right? And so Meno proposes a kind of paradox, he says, about knowledge acquisition. He says that it's impossible to discover knowledge because you either know what you are seeking, and I've tried to write that in this purple color, you know what you're searching for, or you don't, and I tried to write this in this light blue color, right? And so it, is sort of like a fork, right? You accept one option or the other, right? So if you know what you're searching for, then further knowledge seems superfluous, right? What is added? If you know the thing that you want to know, uh, what are you looking for? What is there more to add than you already know, right? But on the other hand, if you don't know what kind of knowledge you're looking for, then you have no means of finding it, right? You have no opportunity to figure out a method for discovering the truth, right? And so Meno's paradox is meant to render paradoxical how it is that we acquire any kind of knowledge at all, right? Socrates generally is not impressed by this, right? Socrates says something to the effect of like, "Oh, Meno, you gave yourself away to all these sophists. This is sort of like sophist argument, right? And it doesn't come out of a true love for wisdom. It comes out of this desire to like just kind of give up on searching for knowledge, right?" So how does Socrates slash Plato answer this? And this is really where the heart of the Meno dialogue comes in, is that Plato answers Meno's paradox by arguing that all cases of knowing are really cases of remembering. Okay? This sounds like very, like, kind of weird, right? But let's explain the basic account and then let's continue to nuance it, right? So the basic account is that your soul contains knowledge of everything in the universe, and when you come to know things, right, what's going on is you're remembering, right? You're remembering these things that your soul in some way already knows, right? That might sound like very implausible, right? Because it's like these things happen in the future, right? Whenever I'm recording this, like 1 minute after I say this, I can say an event is going to happen. How does my soul remember events that happen in the future, right? It seems kind of crazy. But it's worth taking seriously. In particular, it's worth considering, at least for the case of like mathematical and logical knowledge, right? So you might find the idea that, like, okay, your soul somehow contains, in a way that's obscure to itself, all of the knowledge of the universe in it. Fine, that is a little far-fetched in some ways, maybe. But let's try to recreate what's appealing, at least, about this idea, and that's that it can explain how we come to acquire mathematical knowledge, mathematical forms of truth, right? This is what, in particular, Plato's doctrine of remembrance really is meant to bring out, right? And so there's a sequence where Socrates in the Meno dialogue pulls aside a slave with Meno and teaches this slave boy mathematical facts, right? And there's this whole demonstration that happens where they're drawing out squares in the sand, right? And the point of this little interlude, right, is for you to think about the fact that we're able to produce mathematical knowledge in a way entirely on our own, right? Like, the way that Socrates put the point is, I'm not teaching this person how to do math. They are learning how to do it themselves. Like, I'm just propelling them forward with certain kinds of questions. I'm not actually teaching them anything, right? And these mathematical facts, right? Think about a basic mathematical fact, right? Think about 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? When you think about that fact, you might start to think about, like, the time that you learned it, right? So, maybe you were in first grade or something, maybe younger, I don't know, and you learned it in Mrs. Smith's class or something like that, right? Just, that's fine for now. But if someone asked you the question, like, why is 2 plus 2 4, right? You wouldn't say, well, it's 2 plus 2 equals 4 because I learned that in Mrs. Smith's class, right? What do I mean by that? Well, it's the fact, the occasion where you learned it is not the same as the justification underlying it, right? You learned mathematics in Mrs. Smith's class, but Mrs. Smith's class is not why mathematical facts are true, right? In other words, what happened in Mrs. Smith's class is not like how you learn about normal facts, but what you did learn is you learned how to do something with your mind, right? You learned how to manipulate formal systems, numbers, right? Um, and part of Plato / Socrates' points, right, is that these mathematical facts, they harmonize with each other. They are not, even if they are occasioned by someone, right, that someone is not their cause, right? You simply, when you learn mathematical facts, you're like learning how to manipulate, how to use numbers. In the rules about how to use numbers, like that 2 plus 2 equals 4, are eternal, right? They didn't start being true the moment you learned it, but you learned that it was always true, right? They're objective. They're not just features about you and your own psyche and about how you learned it, but they're features of fundamental reality. And then finally, they're rule governed. So when you discover arithmetic, for example, it's not like you just have a big long list of all of the arithmetic relationships that you know up to this point, right? It's not like you have to memorize, okay, 2 plus 0 equals 2. 2 plus 1 equals 3. 3 plus 1, 2 plus 2, etc., 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 right? You don't need a collection about that. You can actually do, basic mathematics with numbers that you've never encountered before, right? So, like, probably you've never thought about the number 44 quadrillion, right? But you can answer the question, what is 44 quadrillion minus 3 quadrillion, right? You don't need to go and like conduct an experiment and ask the world, right? No, you just do the math, right? You know how numbers work, you know how they're related, and so you can, engage in mathematics, right? You can do mathematical formulas and equations even for numbers and quantities that you never experience, right? So, what's the point? Why does Plato say that mathematical truths are cases of remembering? Well, because even if something in the world is the occasion, right, for you coming to know it, it's not the real source of justification. The real source of justification seems to be somehow in this rule governing aspect of it, right? Like, once you learn the rules of arithmetic, you can then go apply it to a whole bunch of other stuff, right? So, in saying that we remember mathematical facts, what Socrates slash Plato is saying is that the soul can spontaneously produce mathematical truths. So, I mean, conduct an experiment, right? Think about a math problem you've never thought about before, right? You didn't learn the answer to this question or equation or something like that from your experience because you're generating it newly for the first time, right? And so our knowledge of mathematics, our knowledge of what we might call a priori truths, are occasioned by things in physical reality, by Mrs. Smith's class or whatever, but their justification resides, I think Plato slash Socrates would say, in the eternal nature of our souls, right? These mathematical relationships, ideas are eternal, right? Our soul, to comprehend them, to contain them, Plato thinks must also be eternal, right? I read here also Leibniz, just because he's an early modern philosopher. A lot of the time I teach early modern philosophy and I enjoy it a lot. He gives a really, really fascinating interpretation of this idea of remembering or recollection as a form of knowledge, because he, like Plato, thinks somehow that like all of the knowledge of the universe, especially like mathematical knowledge, is somehow like contained in your soul, right? Things occasion you to reflect and to probe and to find them, but the truths are in a certain way already inside you. Okay, so I hope that you found the Meno dialogue interesting. Plato is going to continue to develop these themes about mathematical knowledge, about the eternal nature of forms, about the imperishable nature of the soul, further in the Phaedo dialogue. So I look forward to talking to you all about that at a later point. I hope you're having a great day. Bye.